Hi and welcome back. You're with Terry of Bonsai Tree, and today I'm going to be working on this Myrtle communis, the small leafed variety. If you find the following content helpful, then you can thank me by clicking the thanks button just below the video. As with many of these sort of larger specimens, you'll find that they were more than likely collected from a hedge. It was a tree that I worked on some months ago. You'll find that on a video earlier on my channel, and you can see that the tree is now grown very well subsequent to that work, and it's time that I went in and gave it a good cleaning out, then looking at doing some pruning as well as some wiring just to set the structural branches. This tree was essentially just a trunk, a stump collected, as I mentioned earlier. I started off with some basic branch knobs, or branches that were stems, and they were chopped back. Now, to develop second structural branches with that, or building on that with structural branches, there needs to be a logical step from the very thick trunk to the thick structural portions, and continuing along in those structural portions as well. You cannot have a massive jump in taper. That wouldn't make any sense. It would destroy the illusion that you're trying to create. And aesthetically, I don't think it would be very pleasing. At the moment, my intention is still to thicken up some of these branches. For that reason, I don't want to cut the tips. There are a lot of branches that are superfluous. They are going to be removed, so that I'm going to be cutting out first. But I'm going to leave the tips. So I need to thin the tree out rather than cutting it back at first. So thin the tree out first, then take a look at which branches still need to be thickened up and allow those to continue extending by not cutting the tips. The moment you cut the tips, the auxins at those tips redistribute and it starts shooting out the side. What we want is elongation, because this leads to a more rapid thickening of these branches. So as I mentioned, these trees do tend to sucker very aggressively, abundantly, whatever word you want to use. So I'm just going to remove this growth, because this I'm definitely not going to keep. And you can try and pick it off with your fingers, just pinching it off. That does work, but sometimes for the thinner branches it would work, or the thinner suckers it would work. But the thicker, it's going to leave like a stub. Now, after cleaning off the trunk, I'm now going to remove little branches that are growing out the bottom of the structural portions and just open up this area a little bit. So we're working towards creating a basic branch structure and then filling that in with a fine network of branches. So you're going to do this by eliminating growth that's growing out the top of a branch and sort of vertically out the top, and branches that are growing straight down as well, that can be removed. What's going to happen here is that this is going to form a big fist, and therefore a reverse taper. So what you need to do is decide where you want which branches you want to develop further, and removing all branches so that you're only left with two. Now, I would like to do this is consider the space that I'm working with here and where I need to develop a branch into, to fill a negative space. And I would say that these two branches are positioned very well, because I can use this branch wiring it into this area, and I can use this branch to wire into this space. The alternative would be to possibly use this branch, because it also exits from the main trunk line or main branch structural portion in a nice manner, and then remove this and this, so that I'm only left with these two, and that will be a more horizontal layout of branches. If you're ever in a situation where you're not sure what to do, then the best is to do it in phases. So I know I'm not going to need this one, so I can remove that. I know I'm not going to keep this one, because this one is not growing at a very nice angle at all, so we can remove that. I'm using a branch cutter for this work. And now we're left with three possible branches. I'm definitely going to keep this one. And this one, the problem with this, if I use this down here, is that we're then going to sit with this big lump up above it here, which will then have to be reduced and healed over. But I think just to give me some vertical volume, you know, to create volume, I'm going to work with these two branches. Therefore, that means that I must remove this branch. I've now finished thinning out the excess growth that I don't want, and we can move to the next step, which will be to wire. So you can see here that I've already pruned roughly this branch back shorter, because I have a certain outline of the tree in mind. So I know that I need to develop secondary branches from this structural piece, which are going to then have to divide further and further into tertiaries, and then only reach that what is currently an imaginary outline or future outline of the tree. So you need to make sure that your cuts are made within that that final outline or frame. And in a case like this, this branch is probably still too long, because this section, the preceding section of the branch, is maybe that long. So this section is pretty much the same length. So as I said, it was roughly pruned. So I'm going to prune this a little bit shorter. What you want to do is to make sure that every time you prune, the internodes, the length between the bifurcation of a branch, it gets shorter and shorter. And obviously, you need to bear in mind that future profile of the tree, that there is going to be enough space for you to produce all that ramification within that frame. Now I'm going to start with wiring. So I always start with the lowest portions of the tree, and so that you can set those angles of the branches. If you start with start at the top and you work down to the bottom, you might find that the angles that you used at the top is too acute, and you run out of space when you get to the lower regions. Now I'm using aluminium wire for this because it's nice and gentle on the bark, the thin bark of the myrtle. Always just good wiring practice to always make sure that you anchor the wire very well so that there's no movement. And then wire make sure that there's no gaps between the wire and the stem of the plant, because if there are gaps, then you're probably going to have to overexert or exaggerate any bends, and this very often will lead to breaks. I always like to end with an upward bend in the wire, because this helps me or makes it possible for me to end the angle of the branch in a slightly upward growing fashion towards the sun. This will actually strengthen the branch and aid its growing, because it's growing towards the sunlight. When you're putting bends into the branches, always exaggerate the bends, because with time, as the branch thickens up, those bends are going to become smoother and not as pronounced. So make sure to also put bends in so that when you view the branch from the top down, that there's movement, but very importantly from the front as well, it should be visible that there's movement in the branches. Always make sure to use a wire that's adequately thick enough to bend the piece of branch or growth that you are wanting to bend. Otherwise, what you'll find is that you will have to over bend, exaggerate the bend in order to get the branch into position, but then invariably the wire will not be able to hold that position, and then the branch will just return back to the position that it was in. Another great little technique that you can keep in mind when you're bending branches or wiring the branch, and you have a branch like this one, which is coming out of the top of the primary branch, but you don't want to cut that off. You want to keep that. You want to use that. then when you're wiring, wire in a direction that you know that if you were to twist, that the wire will tighten, not loosen. So it needs to be in this case, I'm turning it anti-clockwise. So the wire needed to be laid anti-clockwise. And now this makes it possible for me to bend this branch. And now this branch is it lays in a much better angle, which now renders it useful. Otherwise I would have had to cut it off. I've now finished applying the wire, and as I have applied the wire from the bottom working towards the top, most of the branches have also been positioned, but there are some branches which I still need to give some shape to. However, I just wanted to stop at this juncture and then explain a principle which I think is very important to understand when you're positioning the branches once or after you've applied the wire. And that is that all the branches should emanate or radiate from a sort of a imaginary central point in the tree out. This is necessary for branches to get sufficient sunlight. So it's a very natural shape for them or position for them to be in. And in bonsai, to make that illusion believable, or as much as possible, we want to try and emulate that. Then also imagining a domed shape, a rounded shape, not a triangular shape in this case, but a domed, very rounded shape. What we have is an outline, which is going to be a solid line, obviously with negative spaces as the foliage pads allow in the final creation or design of the tree. But bear in mind that the branches should, the angle of the branches should alter from the base, where they will be very much sitting at a horizontal angle, and then as they move up in the tree towards the apical space or apical zone or area, the branches will become very much more vertical, and then on the other side they go back down again. And now what we want to do is we also want to place bends in these branches. As you can see, you don't want straight sections of branches. That is boring, and you want to make the tree, your canvas, so to speak, is only this big, so you want to make it as interesting as humanly possible. And you do that by using taper. So that's cutting the branches back, so you're building the structure of the tree from the inside to the outside. You also do it by movement, so every time you make that cut, the branch changes the angle, or you can put angles in, movement in, using wire. You also don't need to wire the entire length of the branch, because you're only going to be using the first few centimeters of the branch, pruning back to that point, and then allowing a bifurcation to occur and improving your ramification. So when you're positioning these structural portions, you need to also bear in mind the amount of territory or volume or space that they're going to occupy in the future. You want your positive spaces are the foliage pads, negative spaces being the spaces between the foliage pads. And so you want to, depending on how dense you want the canopy to be, you obviously need a suitable number of branches to build that up with. And I would say to err on the side of caution, have more branches than you think you will need, and rather eliminate them. We're forming foliage pads, so we need to make sure that we space the branches out so that down the line there is room for them to develop, the pads to develop in. If you found that content helpful and you'd like to thank me for it, please do so now by clicking the thanks button just below the video. Completed the work that I wanted to do on this tree today. You'll notice that I have pruned some of these structural branches shorter. I deemed them thick enough and to be cut at this point in time. But these other branches, which are still a little bit thin and have been wired, now will be allowed to grow, to extend, which will both thicken the base of the branch but also secure those bends that I've placed into them with the wire into place. It'll secure them. The next step is really just to take it back outside again, continue to fertilize and water as normal for the rest of the season, and then perhaps take a look, say in about 6 weeks or so, I would say 6 to 8 weeks at the most, and check for wire bite, and then remove the wire from the branches where it is starting to bite in. Hope that you've enjoyed today's session, and until next time, take care. Goodbye.